Yo boys, DDB here, and today we're going to be having a look at a tier list based on how fun the range specs are looking in the War Within. So once again, like I said with about the melee tier list that I made, I've played quite a lot of the War Within beta so far, so I feel like I kind of know for myself at least what I feel that's fun and what's not fun. So once again, we've got it in 5 sections, which is avoid this bin spec, which again will be just avoid it. It's rubbish at the moment. It doesn't feel good. You got needs help. That doesn't feel great to be honest, and it probably, like I say, needs help and like an overhaul or whatever. But currently it's kind of too late for that at the moment, so it probably won't be. We've got I'll try it, which just means it's kind of like in the mid tier of how fun it is. So maybe you should just give it a go, sort of thing. We've got fun spec, which I generally just find, the spec's quite fun and enjoyable to play. And then we've got must play, which is like the S tier of like you need to be playing the spec. It's really enjoyable in my opinion. So Nosy, yep, let's jump into it. So the first one I'm going to have a look at is Arcane Mage. Like a lot of other specs, Arcane's seen quite a lot of changes going into the War Within, with the main thing being like how easy it is to play compared to before. Before it was seen as quite like a high skill cap spec, where now it's not as much. It definitely still has that aspect to it, but yeah, it's a lot easier now with them removing things like Radiant Spark. They did try to change Nether Precision quite a lot during the beta, um, but so far it seems to have stuck. It's mainly seen as well during like passes, like on raids, etc., where you'd see not as many people playing Arcane. A lot of people would just either be playing Frost or Fire, which, in my opinion, are both easier specs than Arcane. So hopefully this bumps up the numbers quite a lot. The second thing is the playstyle's changed a lot now. It's mainly based around barraging. So during the beta cycle, at least so far, barrage is constantly being changed every week. So this is something that could still change. Um, but it keeps getting either nerfed or buffed, and they keep nerfing certain aspects of it, usually just the base damage of it, but buffing it in other places, like its mastery, I think was last week. The previous week was how many like arcane charges you have based around the damage. So we'll just kind of have to wait a couple of extra weeks to see how it like fits and see where they want it to lie. But currently it's like a playstyle where you're just constantly trying to barrage, especially in AoE. So you're not really worrying about your mana too much. It's just kind of building, spending, building, spending. On single target, it's a little bit different, but it's still similar. Another thing with Arcane, it's very high bursty specs still, even with the removing things like Radiant Spark. So they've got like a 1 minute 30 cooldown with Arcane Surge, but that can be further reduced with Shifting Power. And then obviously they've got like a small cooldown every 45 seconds with Magi Spark, which you also will have with Arcane Surge. But yeah, it's very high bursty spec, and it feels like they have it up fairly often. So I think a lot of people have enjoying this spec so far in the beta. I've seen a lot of videos of people just saying, this is really fun compared to what it was before, and I'm also one of them. So for this reason, I'm going to put this in must play. So next up, we've got Fire Mage. Fire's not really seen a whole lot of changes in terms of its playstyle going into the War Within. It still kind of functions around trying to find a high priority target or something with a huge amount of health and just like smashing into it whilst your ignite will spread. But they did change the functionality on Living Bomb, which was before you just kind of pressed it and it just blew up. Well, now it'll proc things off of like your Fire Blast, etc. It can also proc off itself with certain talents. It's all down like the right hand side of the tree currently on the Fire Mage, but it's kind of like gone from when it started, it was like God tier, to now it's not so much God tier. I'm not really sure if it's still going to be worth to play because it's a lot of points to invest into it for something that's doing not as much damage as it used to be. I know when I test it, at least on AoE, just like on target dummies, it's doing around 8% of my overall AoE damage, with the majority just coming from Ignite. But it probably will be higher based on certain situations, as it's based around it doing like burst damage. So like it hits a target and then it kind of blows up and it spreads and then hits again. So if you can get that to happen during like moments where ads spawning or whatever, I'm sure it'll be doing a lot more of your overall. But yeah, currently a lot of it's still just like a lot of your damage is still just coming from Ignite. But I still think this is one of the specs that's really good in like most scenarios, like Raise or M+, as it's a lot more ethical than a lot of other classes. It can be quite bad in low M+, though, as targets don't really have enough health for you to kind of build up a big ignite, and by the time you probably get through halfway through your combust, stuff's already dead. So that's one thing to note, is you probably don't want to play this in low end plus, or if you do, you want to play like a flame strike build, if anything. Another thing similar to before is you're in combustion a lot. They did nerf Sun Kings though by 2 stacks, I think it was. It's before it was 8, and then you can go into a combust, and now it's 10. So you're not in combustion as much as before, but you're still in it a lot. You can also play around with different talents. Like you don't need to take Sun Kings. You can take a talent that's like on the Sun King row as well. It'll just increase your combustion damage, and I think it also reduces the cooldown further. But so far, at least from what I've seen, Sun Kings is still the play. Personally, I'd like to move away from this playstyle, as I really enjoyed Fire Mage when it was, like a 2 minute combustion and you press your combustion and actually feel like you're doing a lot of damage. Um, as I say, it's an actual cooldown at that point, but currently it just kind of feels like you're in combustion all the time, so it doesn't feel as powerful when you're in it. Not saying it's not still strong, it is still pretty strong, but it just doesn't really have that oomph to it anymore, in my opinion. Overall, I think it's a pretty fun spec, as long as you play it in the right scenarios. Like I say, don't try to play it in a low end plus. In raiding, it should be decently fine. So for these reasons, I'll put it in fun spec. And finally, for the mages, we're looking at Frost. It plays fairly similarly to how it did before, where you'll just kind of like build up to 5 icicles and glacial spikes. There are certain builds where you just don't run glacial spike anymore, and you just instead run like an old play style where you're just constantly frostbolting, flurrying, and ice lancing a lot. Um, which I didn't think I'd say this, but I kind of prefer that playstyle now, as glacial spike's been like a staple for a little while. Um, and it's gotten a bit boring in my opinion. You still obviously get them big hits, so if you really enjoy them big chunky hits from glacial spike, then go for it. But I personally prefer the more like fluid play style of just running around ice lancing everything, and frostbolting every now and then. As with that build, at least you'll run like a build where you'll just be gaining more charges of your fingers of frost, that will just increase the damage of your ice lances. So on AoE currently, Frost is doing pretty good, as it's one of its hero talents. It's currently allowing it to just like generate more orbs. You've also got talents that will also generate more orbs based on I think it's frost bolts that are hitting the target. Um, so yeah, just kind of like throwing out a lot of frozen orbs at the moment, and then obviously putting blizzards down on top of that. So they're just doing a lot of AoE damage. If you kind of enjoy that playstyle of just constantly chucking out orbs and just filling in with ice lances or whatever, then this is definitely a good pick for you. Overall, it's a fairly easy spec to play. Um, Generally, I like specs that are like a bit harder and got a bit more to them, like got a bit of a skill ceiling to it. So this isn't really a spec that I enjoy too much. But maybe you will. I know a lot of people love Frost just because it's easy to play. And then obviously a lot of people like the Glacial Spike build, which is just hard hitting every time you build up to 5 icicles. So yeah, I'll put this in. I'll try it. So next up, we're going to have a look at Org Evoker. So obviously it's a very controversial spec ever since it got added. I feel like you either love this or hate this, and on most people they probably just hate it. I personally don't mind it too much, but I'm probably on the side more of just not really caring too much about it. And most people want it deleted, but hey ho, maybe you enjoy this. Who knows? So obviously, Org's all about buffing your allies. So it's obviously just the same as before, where you're just using your Ebon Might, your Breath of Eons, your Prescience, etc. to buff your allies. They've sort of changed this a little bit with the hero talents. They've leaned more into you doing like your own damage with the Scale Commander hero talents. As it feels like, at least to me, the Org's doing a lot more of its like own damage rather than before, where it's like 75%, 80% of its damage is coming from its allies. It does feel like it can like do a little bit of damage on its own, probably at least half amount, or maybe a bit over half of what a normal DPS can do. And then obviously the other hero talent, which is Chrono Warden, is just pretty much purely based on buffing your allies even further. Just probably will be the play, to be honest, as long as you've got like a coordinated group, and your damage dealers in your group are doing high amounts of damage. You can just buff them even further and they'll be doing even more damage. It's probably going to work out a little bit better, as long as with like extra utility that it gives. Yeah, I think if you just enjoy like being like a supporty kind of player, then Org's definitely a good pick for you. Um, I know a lot of people prefer being the guy that's like doing huge amounts of damage, so that's up to you at the end of the day. Definitely know some people enjoy this type of playstyle. You know, like helping your allies do more damage. You can help out the healer, helping out the tank by giving them more armor with things like blistering scales. So there's definitely a lot of things you can do with this spec, which is pretty much why it's always played in M+. It's just so versatile, and it just helps out your team too much, pretty much. But where I'm putting it, I'm probably torn, to be fair, between needs help and avoid bin spec. Um, I did I did feel like I would have put it in bin spec, but I did play it a little bit on the beta, more than I should have. I didn't think I'd even like touch it, to be honest. So I think I just put it in needs help. So next we have Devastation Evoker. Dev's going to play pretty much identically how it's playing currently on live. I'm assuming because it's like a new class going into Dragonflight, so it just didn't really receive any talent changes. You're pretty much going to have a few key buttons that you're going to be pressing with this. One being Disintegrate, which is your main spender. Living Flame, which will be your builder. And Power Spells, which will be Eternity Surge and Flame Breath. They also take talents like Shattering Style, which just increase the damage the target takes for a little while. But it's definitely still pretty easy to play. The only min-maxy thing that it has with it, like in terms of its skill, is how much Dragon Rage uptime you can have. And this is just kind of just fitting in more Eternity Surges and Dragon's Breath in your Dragon Rage. But that's pretty much it. Everything else outside of that is you just building and spending constantly. I will say it does feel a little bit better to play, especially with things like its tier set giving you a Essence Burst on your Eternity Surge, which you press fairly often. So it makes the gameplay feel a lot more fluid, as you're not just constantly spamming Living Flames to try to get an Essence Burst proc. In terms of like specs that I think I get bored with fairly easy, this is definitely one of them, just because it just has so few buttons. Like outside of its empowers, like I say, and if you're not running Shattering Star, your single target rotation is going to be you pressing Living Flame and Disintegrate, and then on AoE it's going to be similar. Instead of you pressing Living Flames, you're going to be pressing Azure Strikes mainly, and then instead of Disintegrate, you're just going to be pressing Pyres. So it's outside of its Empower spells, it's kind of just a two-button class, which maybe you like this, maybe you don't. You've also got the fact that it's a 25-yard class and it's a range spec, which again I don't really like, as it can put you into like bad situations where you want to be close to the boss. Like you can't be max range like a lot of other people being at 40 yards. I know, for instance, Naimi was a perfect boss for this, for it just being like it felt like it was fairly useless. Like you'd get flower spawn at ranged. They'd spawn at like 35-yard ranged, and then the evokers just can't do anything about it because unless they want to go and just do no damage for like 5 seconds, or maybe even more depending on if they're solo soaking. Um, yeah, that's the only way of them dealing with like a mechanic like that, which isn't ideal. So instead of that, they just kind of stand in the middle and just hope a flower spawns in them. And if it doesn't, they're just doing nothing the whole fight at least, other than just their damage rotation. So yeah, at that point they're just like a damage bot, and unless they were doing like ridiculous amounts of damage, which in that tier at least they weren't, you'd be better off just getting in someone else that can do mechanics whilst also doing DPS. So obviously Aug's like this as well, where it has like a 25-yard range. However, I think it's a bit more forgiving with this class, as it can kind of get away with it like by buffing targets, or your allies, sorry. And then it can run off and do a mechanic on its own, and you've already buffed your targets by then. Obviously, you still lose uptime on things like Ebon Might, if you're not hitting the boss, but I don't think it's nowhere near as punishing as a class like Devastation that has to full on just stop doing damage to deal with a mechanic like that. In terms of its hero talents, it doesn't really give it that much more difference in its playstyle. You have Flame Shaper that will give it a spell called Engulf. This will just be a button you press on like a priority target, and it'll deal more damage based on how many periodic effects are on the target. And then it has other functionalities like spreading your fire breath with the hero talent, but it's kind of just the rest of it's all just passive, to be honest with you. You sort of play around it a little bit, but yeah, majority of it's just passive. Scale Commander, I'd say it's probably a bit more fun, at least on AoE, where it'll spread your disintegrates around. I haven't really been able to test this too much, as on dummies at least, it doesn't work, and in M+, I've just been playing Flame Shaper so far. And then the only thing it'll do pretty much on single target, it'll just have like you just if your Disintegrate's not hitting more targets, it'll just get buffed. There is also a node on the Scale Commander that will allow you to deep breath, but now you won't have to go in a straight line. You can kind of like zigzag a little bit, and it'll also increase the damage that the enemies take from, I think it was your spenders, so like your Disintegrate. It does feel a bit wonky to do currently though, as you know, you kind of press your deep breath and you're kind of wandering around, not really doing anything. You know, it does a little bit of damage, but not a lot. And then out of that, then you start doing damage. Where I think they need to add something that you can like cancel it once you hit your target, because at the moment it kind of feels like you hit your target, you go through it, and then you're just kind of just not doing anything. You're just, you know, zigzagging around. So if they had a way for you to kind of just press it, cancel all of it in like a second, and then you can start doing damage, I think that would be a lot better. So once again, I feel like I'd either put this in needs help or avoid bin spec. I feel like just because I put org in here, I shouldn't really put it in here, as it's kind of similar. Like they both have like small amount of buttons to press, so they're similar in that way. Whilst, you know, a lot more people hate, I think, hate me, to be honest, if I put dev below org. So we'll just put this in needs help. So next up we've got Balance Druid, aka Boomy. So Boomy plays pretty similar to how it would before, with I think the main change at the moment being it's playing Convoke instead of its Incarn. So you'll have like damage every minute currently, which I prefer this playstyle at least, rather than having like a big cooldown, like it's lasting a lot longer. So you have like a smaller cooldown, but it's, you know, it's up a lot more often. So it's still playing like with its around its eclipses, with you either building into Lunar or you're building into Solar, depending on if it's AoE or single target, with Solar being your single target choice and Lunar being your AoE choice. And then depending on if it's AoE or single target, you're spending your Astral Power on Star Surges or Starfalls. One thing I will say is I still feel like Starfall needs like a buff or something to it, whereas they added in the Dragonflight that it's able to stack. But currently outside of like high end plus and stuff like that, where targets are living like a good while, like 40 plus seconds or whatever, it doesn't really feel like boomies have that moment to shine on AoE, as by the time, at least when you're playing like lower keys, you stack up a few Starfalls, you know, you get to your higher counts, 4 or 5 Starfall stacks, whatever, and then by the time you've got there, pretty much everything is dead, and you know, you're still like ramping pretty much. So it's a very like rampy spec, especially because you have to put up dots as well with your Sunfires and Moonfires. They do have a bit more burst of their talent changes now, with you gaining access, like easier access at least, to your mushrooms. And then obviously you've got other things like your moon talents, or if you're running Fury Balloon instead. So added a few other nodes, things like Touch of Cosmos, which is allowing you to just gain free star surges when you're casting like things like your Wrath, which feels good at the moment, as they've also nerfed the AP generation a little bit over the course of the beta, so you're not genning as much as you were before, along with you losing your tier set from the previous expansion, which was giving you like a free star surge almost as you enter a new eclipse. In terms of its hero talents, Elun's Chosen's pretty basic and boring in my opinion. It kind of just focuses on your Fury of Elune or your Full Moons, just you being able to use them a lot more and them dealing a bit more damage. And then the other hero talent being Keeper of the Grove, which is just going to focus on your Trents instead, which will be obviously an extra button that you'll take now instead. This will just give you like damage when they're out, and then it also makes them do a lot more damage. And then when you do summon the Trents, it'll kind of give you like stacks of this thing called Dream Surge, which will just do like bursts of damage on your next Wraths. So it kind of adds like a bursty element to it when you spawn them. So I think fun for this spec kind of determines where you're playing it. I think it's similar to Fire, where if you're playing it in like low end plus settings, you're probably not going to have a huge amount of fun. Just because, like I say, by the time you build up a lot of Starfalls, the target's already dead and you don't really get to have that moment of doing a lot of damage. Where if you're playing this in like high end plus or maybe even raiding scenarios where ads are living a lot longer, that's where it has its chance to shine, especially when things are a lot more spread out. That's where Boomy excels. Yeah, like a few of the other specs I've noted, it's fairly easy at the moment. It's only really skill component from what I've seen is still just Star-Lord management, where you're trying to keep up 3 stacks pretty much at all times. So yeah, I think I'll put this in, I'll try it. Let's look at Elemental Shaman next. So Elemental Shaman got a
quote-unquote overhaul going into the War Within pretty recently, where they changed a lot of the talent nodes, and they changed like things like your Maelstrom generation, which kind of just made it feel worse, honestly. They made your Chain Lightning and your things like your Chain Lightning and your Lightning Bolt just not generate as much Maelstrom. But I think the generator's just kind of hitting harder currently. So previously there was kind of like two builds you could run, with there being mainly your Lightning build and your Fire build. Um, Usually, one's way better than the other, and currently the Fire build's just way stronger than the Lightning build. I think the Lightning builds can be fairly strong on AoE, but on its single target is kind of where it struggles, where the Fire build can kind of just deal damage in both scenarios fairly well. When it got reworked, at least it was kind of dealing too much damage, and they ended up gutting it quite a lot, to be honest. And it's currently in a state where it's kind of like, I feel like it's in the middle of the pack at least, so it's not doing, before it was like the best spec in the game on the beta, and now it's kind of just like probably middle, maybe a little bit above middle. So in terms of how it plays, it's fairly similar to before, except from you now have access to Ascendance, like you can actually press it rather than gaining deeper rooted elements, which was like a proc. You'll actually have both now. Um, but yeah, your main cooldown will just be Ascendance. You'll kind of press it. You'll hope for a deeply rooted elements proc during your Ascendance, so you can stay in it as much as possible. And there's also a talent just below it that will increase your haste by 25% during Ascendance. So it's kind of like a mini Bloodlust effect as long as you're in Ascendance. So it definitely feels a lot better than before, as you like. I don't think you'd pretty much ever take Ascendance, just because it was just all it was doing is just allowing you to spam lava bursts, which it's still doing now, but you also gain the 25% haste during Ascendance. On top of that, it kind of feels like you're having your elemental out a lot more often, with things like Skybreaker's Fiery Demise, which is just easier to get to now. So yeah, you definitely want to run this even on single target. On AoE, you pretty much have this up permanently as long as you've got Flame Shocks up. And on single target, you definitely feel like, I feel like it's at least 50%. I'm not sure on the exact numbers, but at least when I've been testing, it feels like I have it up fairly often. I'll say losing the tier set from the last expansion feels quite bad, as before you'd just be like kind of crapping out lava bursts left, right, and center once you press Primordial Wave, where now it doesn't do that anymore. So there is one thing to consider. One thing that I do love that they changed though is Ice Fury, where before you'd press it every 30 seconds and then you'd gain, like, I think it was 4 stacks of Frost Shock that would deal extra damage. And now they've changed it so that it procs off your Lava Burst, which is RNG, like you'll just have a chance to gain an Ice Fury, and then you just press it, it's instant cast, and then your next 2 Frost Shocks are just like giga buffed. I think they're doing a lot more damage than they were with the 4 stack from live at least as well. But yeah, it is RNG obviously, but it just feels better to not have to like cast manual Ice Fury. The hero talents, you've got 2 options, one being Farseer, which to be honest doesn't really do a lot. It kind of just spawns ancestors. They'll just help you do damage. They'll just use like Lava Burst and Elemental Blast and things like that. So you don't really need to play around anything with that currently. And then the other one being Stormbringer, but you only really run this on the Lightning build. It's all focused around you doing lightning damage. In terms of where I put this, I think if they buff the generation of your Maelstrom a bit, it'd feel a lot more like fluid to play. Where at the moment it just feels like you're constantly like pressing like lava bursts or lightning bolts or whatever, and it doesn't really feel like you're gaining a lot of Maelstrom. Um, like I said, the spenders like Elemental Blast, Earthquake, etc. are hitting like really hard, so that kind of makes up for it. But I suppose it's just being used to the older playstyle where you're constantly like gaining Maelstrom and constantly spending it. But yeah, either way, I'll put this in. I'll try it. So next we've got the Warlock specs and first Affliction. Affliction is just going to be a dot spec where you'll put things up like your Unsable Affliction on your main target. You'll put things up like Corruption, or you'll press Seed on AoE to spread your Corruption, and then Agony, which will build your shards, which will then spend with Raptures. So it's fairly similar to before. They did get a few talent changes, mainly towards I think the bottom row at least, adding like a few extra random nodes here and there that will just kind of do extra damage. In terms of its playstyle, it's pretty much similar to before, at least on, well, single target. You'll put your dots up, and then you just sit there spamming your raptures out when you've pressed your cooldowns and shadow bolts. It's a spec that's obviously it'll feel a lot better the more and more haste it gets. Currently, it just kind of feels like it doesn't just have enough shard generation, so you just end up sitting there spamming shadow bolts for a long time. There are things like Tormented Crescendo, which will make this feel a tiny bit better. With when you've got all your dots up on the target, your shadow bolt will have a chance to gain you a free Malefic Rapture cast. It will be instant cast, um, and it obviously won't cost a shard. There is sort of like a bug with this. I'm assuming it's a bug at least at the moment, where if you kind of like press a shadow bolt, go to cast like a manual rapture, and you'll get the proc from this, which will give you an instant cast. You'll consume the instant cast, even though like you're casting, which is fair enough, but it'll also incur like an extra global cooldown, which just doesn't feel right at the moment. So hopefully they fix that. Yeah, but yeah, outside of that, all you're doing is just you're building your shards for your cooldowns because that's what it feels like you have shards enough for, at least on single target. But yeah, other than that, it just kind of feels like you're just constantly pressing shadow bolts. Outside of like your cooldown windows where you just be spamming all your raptures anyways. So you press your Dark Glare or whatever, your Soul Rot, your Phantom Singularity, whatever you've got. You'd spend as much shard as you can during that window, and then outside of that, you're just letting your shards build back up to the next 1 minute window or the next 2 minute window. Um, whilst you'll spend Tormenting Crescendo procs, which is the instant cast, free raptures. But other than that, you're just pressing Shadow Bolts constantly, and it honestly doesn't feel very good outside of cooldowns. In terms of the hero talents, you've got Hellcaller and Soul Harvester, with Hellcaller changing your corruption to Wither instead. Wither's just pretty much going to be a harder hitting corruption that will also gain stacks, and then it'll get buffed by things like your Malevolence, which is also a 1 minute cooldown. So this will just make it so every time you're pressing your Rapture, it will just gain a stack. And then things like your Blackened Soul, which is another node on the tree, which will just remove a stack but deal a bunch of damage extra to it. So with this, it's similar to how you would do it on single target, where you gain as many shards as you can, ideally 5 before your cooldowns, press your cooldowns, have all your dots up, whatever, and then you just spam raptures out so that your wither just gains like a bunch of stacks, and then your blackened things like a blackened soul will just eat the stacks up and deal more and more damage. For Soul Harvester, it's kind of just all passive, to be honest. The main thing being Demonic Soul, which you'll have, which will just give your soul chance that you generate have a chance to be a succulent soul. And then if they are, they kind of just deal extra damage from other things in the talent tree, like things like soul and themia, which would just be a dot depending on if the soul was a succulent soul or not. And then the only other like fairly big notable change you can probably say on this is that when you do press soul rot, you'll just gain 3 extra soul shards. I think this is another spec that kind of needs time to ramp as well. So if you're in once again, unfortunately, if you're in low end plus settings and you don't have time to, put up things like your Vile Taint, your Seed Spread, Pressure Darkler, and then start doing damage, ramping up things like your Rapture so that they gain like 10 stacks and actually start doing damage. It can still do fairly well, but again, it needs time to start doing damage. And like I said before, just because I feel like it feels like a Shadow Bolt bot on single target currently, especially with Soul Harvester because it buffs your Shadow Bolts as well, and I think it's actually a top damage, which feels really strange. I don't think I like this spec too much at the moment, so this is the first spec that I'm actually going to put into avoid bin spec, unfortunately. So next up we've got Demonology Warlock. The demo is going to be based around your pets doing a large portion of your damage, with things like your Felguard that we'll summon. You'll get things like your imps that you'll spawn from your Hand of Gul'dans, and then things like your Dreadstalkers, etc. that you'll also summon. There's just a bunch of stuff that you'll be summoning over the course of your rotation with this spec. So like before, what you want to do with this is you want to summon as many demons as you can as possible. So obviously, like I said before, you have your Felguard out. You'll try to spawn as many imps as you can in a 10-second window, as after 10 seconds they'll start expiring. You'll summon things like your Vile Taint, your Dreadstalkers, and then you'll be pressing your Demonic Tyrant. So yeah, you have as many demons out as possible. You'll summon your Tyrant, which will buff them and also buff itself. And then that's where the majority of the damage is going to be coming from. Also added Doom back into the game, which you kind of just use on AoE currently, as it just deals like AoE damage on expiration. And then they also added, I think it's like the tier set that they currently have in Dragonflight, which will just spawn a Doom Guard. I know during the start of the beta release, this thing was like doing way too much damage, but they've kind of toned it down now, and at the moment at least, you're not playing this. Doom's definitely a weird thing to play around, especially with things like Doom Eternal, which will cause your demonic cores from your things like your Doom Bolt, which will reduce the duration of your Doom by 2 seconds. I think the only thing with Doom that a lot of people don't like is kind of like the tab target you need to do with it. Because you get Doom when you Doom Bolt a target. So what you'll do is you use one of your demonic cores from your demon bolts on a target, and then you'll swap to another one, and then you'll swap to another one, and just constantly keep spending them demon bolts on different targets, so you just get as many dooms out as possible. Where I feel like they probably should add something where you can like stack dooms on the same target, but it might be too strong to be honest if they do that, especially on single target. Um, but yeah, that's one thing I know a lot of people don't like doing currently is tab targeting to a bunch of other things to apply Doom. So I think if you enjoy specs where the majority of damage actually isn't really coming from you and it's more coming from your pets, you'll enjoy this. Like I say, you're just kind of raising an army constantly to deal damage for you. And the only damage you really do is from things like Hand of Cooldowns, but even then, every time you press a Hand of Cooldown, it's spawning imps for you, which is just, raising your army bigger and bigger. In terms of its hero talents as Diabloist and Soul Harvester, with Soul Harvester being the same as it was with Aff, it kind of just is passive, Demonic Souls are the same with Succulent Souls, you just give your Hand of Cooldowns a chance to deal extra damage, and then Diabloist, which is the one that's looking really, really good at the moment. It just received a lot of damage buffs as well, but even in terms of like, I'll say how fun it is to play, I think it's really good. So what we'll do is when you spend a Soul Shard, you'll gain something called Diabloist Ritual for 20 seconds, and then spending more Soul Shards will reduce the duration of this. And then when it hits 0, you'll spawn things like a Pit Lord or a Mother of Chaos or an Overlord, and it rotates at the start, but I don't think it drops with combat currently. Yeah, we'll be spawning one of the 3 of these things, and all doing different things. With your mother, like they all do damage on their own, but your mother will give you Infernal Bolt, which will change your Shadow Bolt into Inferno Bolt. This will just do like a bunch of more damage. But instead of gaining you 1 Soul Shard from a Shadow Bolt, it will now gain you 3 from Infernal Bolt. Your Overlord, which won't actually do anything for you really in terms of like giving you an extra ability, but it'll do something called a Wicked Cleave, which is just a massive attack in front of it. But yeah, you'll see this. It just does a huge amount of damage currently, especially because it got buffed. And then the Pit Lord that you summon will change your Hand of Gul'dan into Ruination. Will just be a buffed Hand of Gul'dan. So it'll still spawn imps like it would before with Hand of Gul'dan, but also do like a bunch of extra damage, like direct damage. And then on the trees you also get things like Abyssal Domination, which just empowers your Demonic Tyrant even further, which goes back into like a playstyle of you actually doing damage with your Tyrant, like before in, I think it was like Shadowlands, it would be your top damage. Along with talents, things like Reign of Tyrion, your Tyrant's actually going to be doing quite a lot of damage now. So personally, I've been having quite a lot of fun with this spec on beta, and it's always been a spec that I've really enjoyed. So personally, I'm going to put this into must play. So Distraction's up next, and being the last Warlock spec. Distraction's definitely seen some ups and downs on the beta, with it currently being in its highest state of how good it is. I think it's at the start, it's things like its Avatar of Destruction, which will just cause you to spawn like a mini Smoldron to do damage, which is doing way too much. They've kind of nerfed that now, and it's not doing as much. And then it kind of went out for this state of not really doing a whole lot of damage, and now it's back to being like king again, pretty much. At the moment, at least, it's kind of having like a wonky playstyle of you pressing Rain of Fires. They did nerf this recently. I'm not still sure if it's like viable to still do. We'll have to find out in then like the next week or so, like people actually doing testing. So what you'll do is instead of you pressing your Shadow Bolts to like dump your shards, you would instead be doing this with your Rain of Fires, just because you're gonna have so much shard generation. On top of Rain of Fire being instant cast and Chaos Bolt being like and obviously a cast, where the only time you'll actually be pressing Shadow Bolts are things like whether you got the Diabloist talent, and every time you're about to spawn like an Overlord, a Mother, or a Pit Lord, it will reduce the like cast time of your Shadow Bolt. And then other things like your Ritualist of Ruin, which will just give your Shadow Bolt like a free cast, and it won't cost anything, along with your Rain of Fire. So yeah, there's just niche situations where you'll be pressing Chaos Bolt. And then you've got talents that you also take, like things like Shadow Burn, which would be a 1 soul shard spender. This will still apply things like Eradication, which is just a damage buff to your target, so it's still good for that. And again, it's instant cast, so you don't have to worry about casting anything. Yeah, at least at the moment, you're kind of just summoning your Infernal and putting your Immolate up or whatever. You can also do this with Soulfire, which you'll run currently, which will just do like a bunch of damage and also apply Immolation. And then, like I said, you'll just be spending your Soul Shards with your Shadow Burns and your Rain of Fires, with trying to keep your Shadow Burn on cooldown as much as possible. And then Chaos Bolting whenever you have a proc, pretty much. So hopefully they change this, and I'm pretty sure they will, because they don't want people Rain of Firing on single target. Like I say, it's not too much the damage component that's the problem, it's more the soul shards. Like, we just got too many. Like I said, recently they did nerf the amount of soul shards that you can actually gen, so maybe this will help alleviate it a little bit, but I still don't think it's enough. They'll need to do like some major changes with Rain of Fire and how it works on single target at least. In terms of the hero talents, it's, as I say, it's got Diabloist and Hellcaller, with Hellcaller giving you Wither again. You don't really play this at the moment, it's just kind of just too weak. And I covered this on the AF part if you want to hear me say about it anyways. But instead, the Diabloist one, again, it just spawns either a Pit Lord, a Mother, or an Overlord to do damage for you. And then obviously it will reduce the cast time of your Chaos Bolt when you're about to spawn them as well. So yeah, this is the part, like I say, where you'll just be spending your Chaos Bolts on. They'll just be doing more damage and they have reduced cast time. For AoE though, it doesn't really change. Like, you'll be pressing Rain of Fire on AoE regardless. You won't be pressing Shadow Burn or Chaos Bolt. So on AoE, it's pretty much still the same. You know, you keep your Immolations up, you press your Rain of Fires, and then at least with the Diabloist talent, you still getting Ruinations from your Pit Lords. Wicked Cleaves are happening, and then your Mother also giving you Inferno Bolt. So in terms of where this lies, for me at least, in terms of how fun it is, I actually don't mind the Rain of Fire single target playstyle. As I think it adds quite a little bit of complexity to the spec, especially with where you're needing to press Chaos Bolts, and actually makes a big difference if instead of you just spamming Rain of Fires. But I don't think this will stick. 'Cause they'll probably find a way to make it so Rain of Fire just isn't pressed on single target, as a lot of people just don't like that. Um, but overall, I put this in fun spec, to be honest. Right, so next up we've got the Hunter specs, and first we've got BM Hunter. BM Hunter is just going to be focused around your pets doing the majority of your damage, whilst you're just kind of sitting there buffing them and casting spells like Kill Command. So it plays fairly similar to how it was before. It's got quite a few talent changes that currently mix it up a little bit. Thing with BM that you kind of need to take notice of is just keeping your frenzy up on your pets. So you can like stack this up by pressing Barb Shot, and it'll stack up to 3 times. So what you'll do is you'll just get to 3 stacks as soon as possible, and then you'll just be spending Barb Shots towards the end of like the cycle just to refresh the buff. Currently, you don't really have a lot of Barb Shots in order to be pressing. Like before, you could kind of get away with sort of like spamming them a little bit, but at the moment with like low gear levels, etc., you kind of need to be a bit wary, especially with the haste levels. So trying to let you like frenzy drop towards the like 1 to 0 second mark, and then reapplying it to get the 3 stacks is currently what you need. Otherwise, sometimes you will like drop your frenzy stacks. But Bestial Wrath does help this, as is there a talent that will just gain you 2 barb shots when you enter your Bestial Wrath. So that still feels really nice. There are talents also that will just give you procs for barb shot, so that keep that in mind as well, as sometimes you can just overcap. But overcapping is generally better than just dropping your frenzy entirely. One thing that they sort of changed going into the War Within is the amount of button bloat that BM needed in order for its rotation to get started. As that's just not a good thing, to be honest. You've still got things like Dire Beast and Bloodshed that you need to press before you can start doing damage, but they did remove a couple of things. So the spec definitely does feel a little bit better, at least starting off its rotation. So one thing I was saying about you gaining extra barb shots on your procs, one of the hero talents you have is Dark Ranger, which will help with this. So it'll give you an ability called Black Arrow, and each time the Black Arrow deals damage, it has a chance to give you an extra barb shot stack. So this can kind of help out with like when you've got low gear levels and you're struggling to keep up your frenzy. For the other hero talent, we've got Pack Leader, which is kind of just passive and kind of happens regardless of what you're doing. So Vicious Hunt is the main thing with Pack Leader. It'll just like make your kill command do extra damage.
terms of how easy it is, it's always been a fairly easy spec and it's very mobile. You can just do everything on the move of this spec. You don't really have casts. You know, Barb Shot's instant cast. You've got Cobra Shot, which is instant cast. You've got Kill Commands, which are instant casts. So if you kind of enjoy just like doing damage and not really caring about mechanics, holding your DPS back, then BM Hunter is definitely a good choice. So where I'll be putting it is probably I'll try it. I think it's in between of like it's probably pretty close to fun spec, but it kind of depends if you enjoyed like easy specs. I'd say this is definitely a good to give it a go though. So next and the last of the range hunter specs is MM Hunter. MM Hunter is pretty much the complete opposite of BM in terms of it doesn't want to have a pet out as it gains a damage increase for not having a pet out. So the majority of damage it's coming from is like things like a rapid fire and a aim shots. They made quite a few nice actually talent changes going in the War Within for MM Hunter. So you have things like towards the bottom end of the tree for it as calling the shots, sorry, which is every 50 focus you spend reduce the cooldown of your true shot, which is your main cooldown, so you just have this up a lot more often. They changed Wailing Arrow quite a lot now, so with an extra point that's just below it called Readiness, it'll make it so your true shot actually generates a Wailing Arrow, which is just in place of your aim shot, and then that will also give back all charge of your aim shot on your rapid fire, which you can get in just your normal rotation as well as you just hit the target, like with wind arrows, etc. As it'll be stacking up. So generally, you'll want to like try to spend all your aim shots and your rapid fire just before you know you're going to get a proc of Wailing Arrow. You'll get the Wailing Arrow proc, you'll press that, which also does quite a lot of damage at the moment, and then you can just like repeat again as you gain 2 stacks of aim shot and the rapid fire for free. They're also a pretty versatile class as they have like things like Careful Aim, which increases the aim shot damage when the target's above 70% of its health, and then they've got pretty good execute with things like Bullseye in their talent tree, which makes it so when you're dealing damage to targets below 20% health, you gain a 1% stacking crit chance increase up to 30, so that goes all the way up to 30%. So you kind of have like a good start and a good ender, where like the middle part ground between like 70 and 20 is kind of just like your weakest point, but any target that's above 70 and any target that's below 20 is kind of like where you're just strongest. In terms of its hero talents, it again has Dark Ranger, which again will just be Black Arrow, and it'll have a chance to just give you a charge of your aim shot for free. And then you've also got Sentinel, which is the main one at the moment, and I kind of feel like it's a bit too overtuned. This is kind of just all passive, to be honest, which your attacks will just have a chance to just spawn like an owl that'll just do a bunch of damage to targets, alongside the last node, which is called Lunar Storm, which will cause your rapid fire every so often to summon a celestial owl, which again will just be doing a bunch of damage to the targets. So yeah, MM's just all about hard hitting spells. As I say, you don't need your pet out. During like if you're in an M plus run or anything, then people might ask you to get a pet out to use Bloodlust, but you can kind of like summon it, dismiss it, and then press the Bloodlust to take it away, and then your Lone Wolf will start stacking up again. That's the only other time that you'd have to have a pet out. So for me, I quite enjoy this spec quite a lot. So I'm going to put it into the fun spec tree. So for the last spec, we have Shadow Priest. So Shadow Priest has always been known as quite a high skill ceiling spec. The talent tree didn't actually change going into the War of Him because it got quite a lot of changes during Dragonflight. I think it changed almost every season, to be honest, in some sort of way. So they haven't actually changed the right side, like the spec side for Shadow. So in terms of how it functions, you kind of just put up dots and then you press things like your Mind Blast, your Void Torrent, etc. to gain Insanity, and then you just dump that Insanity with Devouring Plagues. But the hard part about it is trying to fit in all them abilities whilst Devouring Plague is also up, as they gain a damage increase due to its mastery. And then you've obviously got your main cooldowns, which are Dark Ascension and Void Form. Void Form being the most popular one. They'll just kind of put you into a form where you gain an extra ability called Void Bolt, and you're just doing more damage in the form basically. It is still sort of target capped in how it does damage on AoE, with Shadow Crash only applying it to 8 targets. But if you do have Void Form ready and you know the tank's gonna like pull big, or you're in a raiding environment where there's a lot of things spawning, you can sort of like vamp touch stuff before it gets into the middle and everything's being cleaved, and then you can throw a crash just after, and then you'll just have more targets to that you'll be able to AoE on top of that. As the main form of their AoE comes from a spell called Psychic Link, which will just make it so all your whatever you're hitting as your main single target, as long as it's got like dots up on extra things, they'll also be taking extra damage. and things like apparitions will also be spawning and hitting them for extra damage. So similar to Fire Mage, it's quite an ethical spec, as you'll just be funneling into one big target, like a boss for example, and you're just kind of cleaving everything around it as long as it's got dots on them. They do also gain a little bit of funnel damage with this as well, because every target that's been hit with your dots is also gaining you apparitions, and there's certain talents that will also make it so your Vamp Touch, for example, is giving you insanity. For its hero talents, it has two, which are Void Weaver and Archon. So Archon's fairly simple. Just make your halo like a continuous pulsing halo rather than just being like one halo. Over the course of like 5 seconds, it just keeps pulsing and then it will kind of like pulse out, return to you, and pulse out. I think it happens about 3 times. So you just get multiple halos with this, and then you'll be gaining things like Surge of Insanity, which is just for your Mind Flays or your Mind Spikes to do extra damage. The hero talent that I personally really like is Void Weaver, as with every time you're pressing your Void Torrent, which is currently on like it's a 45-second CD, but you can lower it to 30 with an extra talent. It'll create a rift at your target's location, and then it will just kind of just do AoE damage in the area, and then eventually it will just kind of blow up and do extra damage. When the rift's out as well, you also gain Void Blast, which will replace your Mind Blast, and it's just kind of a mega buffed version of itself. So I think it deals like an extra, like anywhere between 3 to 4 times as much as a normal Mind Blast. And this did get nerfed as well, so it was dealing even more. So yeah, it's just you just gain Giga Mind Blast with this. So what you want to try to do with this at least is you want to spawn the Rift with Void Torrent and try to just get as many Void Blasts in as possible, at least 2 minimum. It doesn't really matter at the moment if you actually overcap on Mind Blast charges, as long as you're getting 2 out, because the Void Blasts are actually just hitting so hard that it doesn't matter. There are situations where you can actually get 3 in as well if you're very lucky with a Mind Blast proc. And then to help you out even further, Void Weave, every time you're casting your Void Torrent, you'll actually just be gaining a Mind Devour proc, which just lets you cast a Devouring Plague for free, and it does a bit of extra damage. But like I said, the spec hasn't really seen a lot of changes, but I still really enjoy it, especially with the Void Weaver build. With the Archon, not so much, but I think just because of Void Weaver, I'll have to put this into must plays. I've just really enjoyed this spec throughout most of Dragonflight, and Void Weaver just makes it feel even better. So yeah, guys, that was my tier list on how I think things are shaping up and how fun some of these range specs are looking. If you feel like your spec that you currently play or have played should be higher, then let me know your opinion down below. As always, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.